Hi, everybody. I'm Rohama Welcher. I used to be a classroom teacher for quite a few years, then in the UK and in the US. Then I moved to South Africa and I started a teacher training organization, and I've been doing teacher training. So welcome, thank you for coming on. In my role in teaching and in training teachers, I've always been a very big advocate for active learning. So active learning, as it sounds, are activities that put the student at the center of the learning rather than just passive recipients for information, right? So there are activities that rely a lot less on the teacher and a lot more on the students. The learning is done because of them, through them, not just by them. I'm sure you're familiar with the expression guide on the side instead of sage on the stage, right? It's a well-known expression. So I think it's always seemed like a really good idea, active learning. There's a lot of research to show that it promotes critical thinking, it improves student retention, it promotes skills for lifelong learning, which is very important because what we can teach them in the classroom is finite, but if we can teach them how to continue to learn and question and think about things, we've taught them a whole lot more, right? So it's always seemed like a really good idea, but at the moment, in the current circumstances, it's become absolutely critical because we're not there to guide them every single step of the way. So we need to be able to design activities that they can, for the most part, that rely a lot less on us and a lot more on them, where they're doing more of the work than we are. So, and I think also we're starting to really feel the limitations of Zoom teaching in terms of very, very limited engagement with students, very limited interactivity, very limited opportunity for critical thinking. In terms of sometimes there being limited devices per family, so not every child is able to access Zoom. In terms of Zoom fatigue, where students just cannot sit and watch a teacher teach for hours on end on a screen. And also in terms of it taking a toll on teachers. For a lot of teachers, they have their own families at home while they're teaching, and it's just, it's too much to navigate. So we're going to be talking about, again, using activities that rely more on activities that rely more on the students and less on the teachers. If I just share my screen with you so I can show you my outcomes. So the outcomes for this session are to be able to design learning activities that rely less on the teacher and more on the students, and that require more critical thinking and active engagement from the students compared to, say, Zoom. Now, what we're going to be talking about is using projects to learn. Now, to clarify a very, very important premise at this point, we're not talking about teaching and then doing a project, okay? That's as old as teaching itself. It has a lot of importance. It can be very, very valuable to do a project at the end of learning something, okay? It moves students up on Bloom's taxonomy from just knowledge and understanding through to analysis and synthesis and application, evaluation, and so on. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about learning from a project. Okay, so the project is presented at the beginning of the unit before the students have learned the material, and they learn in order to be able to complete the project. And why I say this is such a fundamental premise, and I'm going to clarify this through examples, is that by doing it in this way, by presenting the project before the learning takes place, we create relevance, we create meaning, we create purpose for the learning. So that's the premise. I'm going to show you how it works. I also just want to add that it's based on aspects of project-based learning, problem-based learning, and inquiry-based learning. It's not exactly any of them, but it's based on aspects of all of them. And I would encourage you, if you have the opportunity, to look them up for more ideas and for a deeper understanding. So to get into it straight away, what we do for this, when we want to teach in this kind of way, is we begin by giving the students a key question or project instruction. So for example, key question, could there be another Great Depression? Or where does rain come from? Or how do seeds become plants? Okay, again, they haven't learned this. They haven't learned the water cycle. but we're starting the unit by saying, where does rain come from? They haven't learned about the Great Depression, but we're starting by saying, could there be another Great Depression? Or alternatively, a project, so which isn't linked to a key question. So projects, so say, for example, we're going to be creating a museum to show how the Native Americans lived. So that would be a project. Step number 2, after we've told them about this, is that as a group, we meet together. So either on Zoom, in the classroom, you would do this in the classroom, but at the moment, you would do this probably via Zoom. We would meet for 15 minutes to discuss what questions do we need to ask and what are we going to need to know to be able to answer this. So if we're going to be answering the question of could there be another Great Depression, we're going to have to ask ourselves what caused the Great Depression, what was going on at the time, was there any legislation put in place to prevent another Great Depression? How does the current does the current economic setup compare to what there was then? Okay, or for example, if our key question is, where does rain come from? So what do you think we can ask ourselves in order to be able to answer this question? So we would guide the students potentially, if they don't answer this themselves, to maybe question, where does rain go to? If we understand where rain goes to, maybe that will help us understand where rain comes from. Because it isn't just falling and falling and flooding the earth more and more and more. Something's happening to it, and what's happening to it, maybe that can help us understand what happens to the rain and then where rain comes from. Or how did the Native Americans live, if we're going to be building a museum of artifacts to show how they live. So how did they keep warm in the winter, and what did they eat, and what did they wear? What are we going to need to explore and investigate to be able to answer this? So that's number 2. Number 3 is we then present the students with our resources. So there are 2 kinds of resources that I want to talk about that are specifically important to understand at this point in teaching history, shall we say. So there are synchronous resources which are presented in real time. So that's like we're doing now. So it's either a webinar or a teleconference, something like that, where everybody's meeting all at the same time. Everyone's discussing all at the same time, right? The big advantage of this is that it's nice to connect, and there is opportunity for collaborative learning, for discussion. Everyone's on at the same time. The other option is to use asynchronous resources. Asynchronous resources are not presented in real time. That means you send them to the students and they can look at them at any time that they want. So for example, you might send a pre-recorded video that they can watch, okay? You might send a WhatsApp voice note of you explaining something. It could be printed material, it could be low tech, okay? It could be online resources that you direct them to, say a YouTube video explaining how to calculate simultaneous equations. It could be independent research that they do online. You tell them, I want you to research this using the web, okay, and so on. So anything that they don't have to do at the same time as everybody else, they don't have to sign on at a specific time, they can do it in their own time. So the big advantage of asynchronous resources is that the students can do it at their own pace. So and this is a huge opportunity for differentiation. So say, for example, back to the example of watching a YouTube video or the teacher explaining how to calculate simultaneous equations, how to solve simultaneous equations. A weaker student can listen as many times as they need to. A bright student might understand it the first time, and somebody else might need to listen 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, an infinite amount of times, okay, until they understand it, which gives you a huge advantage over regular classroom teaching, in that the students can work at their own pace, a huge differentiation advantage. There's also the possibility of using blended learning resources. So that's a combination of both, some synchronous resources, some asynchronous resources. And ultimately, like, that's a possibility to think about when we actually do get back to the classroom, of directing the students to some videos that they can listen to over and over and over again. They can watch over again so they can understand, some real-time teaching and so on. But okay, let's leave that for now. So we're going to be talking about either synchronous resources, asynchronous resources, or blended, or a combination of both. So the teacher shares the resources with the class. So say, I'm going to give you now, we're back to the Great Depression example. You're going to be looking at a lot of historical sources that I'm going to send to you. Maybe you're going to be looking this up online yourself. There are a whole load of options as to how you may wish to do this. Maybe we are going to have a Zoom lesson, but I'm going to be explaining this to you in order to be able, I'm going to give you the resources so that you are able to answer the question. We also clarify expectations. Expectations for content and for presentation, just to make sure that we don't get an empty fluffy project at the end, right? So I need you to use the following keyword. I need you to use, to quote X amount of sources. If for the museum example, I need a minimum of 3 artifacts. I need you to explain for each one, I need a written description for each one explaining what it was made of and how it was used, for example, to make sure that this is going to be in line with, so that the project at the end, we're not disappointed by what we receive at the end. And then the next step is the students take this away and they actually do the work, right? So this is pretty much self-explanatory. They do the research and they create the project that you've asked them to do. We're going to come back to checkpoints and assessment a little bit later when I talk about an example. And the final thing is that they submit or present their work. So submission could be, they could email you the work, they could drop off at your house, depending on the lockdown restrictions, drop off at the school, okay? Or there's the option to present their work. So presentation could be, it could be that they create a video of themselves and you can send it around the class that they can all watch each other's videos. Or I think the best way to handle this is by doing this on Zoom. Have a live, this is a really nice way to use Zoom where there actually is engagement, have a live Zoom session where everybody meets together and everybody has a chance to present their work and show the rest of the class. Sorry, I see someone's trying to ask me a question. It's a big group. I'm not going to be able to answer questions as I go along, but at the end, I'm happy. If you have something to ask me or something, there'll be time for questions at the end. But if you send me something on chat, or I'm not going to be able to see it right now, sorry. Okay, so to look at an example. So example number 1 that we're going to discuss is a project where the students have to design a house for a spider. So when we originally discussed the project, we're going to meet. I'm going to tell them that the project is about designing a house for a spider. And then we meet to discuss what are we going to need to know, or what questions do we need to ask ourselves in order to be able to do this, okay, in order to be able to build a house for a spider. So we need to know what size the house for a spider should be. So how are we going to work that out? So if we can figure out how big a human's house is, okay, if we can find that out, and how big the average human is, and then we can find out how big a spider is, we can choose a specific spider. This is, you can choose any spider that you want. We find out the size of the spider, then we can work out how big the spider's house needs to be. But how are we going to be able to do that? Well, for that, we need to learn something called ratio. So now just to go back to what I said originally about using projects to learn. This isn't learning ratio and then at the end doing a project, right? You with me? It's not, we're going to learn how to calculate ratio in a boring way, and at the end I'm going to give you a project to build a house for a spider. I'm presenting the project first, okay? The purpose of what we're going to be doing is building a house for a spider. And now what do we need to do in order to be able to do that? Well, we need to learn ratio. Well, now ratio is something that is meaningful and relevant, and there's context, okay? It's the purpose for the learning rather than the opportunity to apply the project, okay? So the project gives the whole learning purpose and meaning. And now I'm actually happy to learn ratio. I don't resent it and I'm not bored by it, because this is something I need to do in order to be able to build my house for my spider. Next step is the teacher's going to provide resources and expectations. So resources might include a YouTube video in which either the teacher, is explaining how to calculate ratio, or there's probably 30 brilliant ones on YouTube that you can find. Okay. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought for a second, excuse me. Or you might choose to do a Zoom session in which you teach the students how to calculate ratio. But the advantage again of using a YouTube video is that you can watch it over and over again, and every child can watch it as many times as they need to. And then you'll also provide your expectations. So when you send me this house for a spider, it needs to have 2 rooms, minimum of 2 rooms, or minimum of 2 stories and 4 rooms. It needs to have a front door. It needs to have 4 windows. It needs to have a table. It needs to have chairs, etc., all to scale. So that way I make sure that I'm not just getting a shabby job from one student, a slapdash project, okay? And then also the expectations for presentation. So either you can build an actual house, or you can draw a house on a poster to scale, or draw it and annotate it with the measurements and submit that. Then the students take it away and they do the actual research and they start designing a house for a spider. Now at this point, I said I was going to come back to this. I want to talk about checkpoints and assessment. You see, the thing is that a project like this probably takes a week for the students to complete, right? It's not a one-day, excuse me, sorry. It's a project that probably takes them about a week to complete. So I need to check in with them at certain points for two reasons. Number one, I need to make sure that they're on track, because I don't want it to come to Friday morning when they need to submit and they're scrambling around and they haven't done this. They're children and they need guidance, and they need us to help them manage their time and self-regulate. So we give them certain checkpoints, okay? So on Monday morning, I'm going to tell you about this project. By say Tuesday, 6 p.m., I want you to have watched the video on how to calculate ratio, and I'm sending out a worksheet with some ratio problems that you have to submit by Tuesday, 6 p.m. just to make sure so that I can make sure that you know how to do this. And then on Wednesday morning, we're going to meet as a class on Zoom and maybe play a game, a ratio game, again, to consolidate and make sure that everybody knows how to do it. And that's the second purpose for checking in with them, is besides for making sure that they're on track, we also need to assess them to make sure they've understood it before they go on to complete the project. So projects generally are cumulative, and the information required to complete a project is usually cumulative. So they can't build the house if they haven't understood ratio properly. It's going to be a useless waste of their time. So I need to assess that they've understood ratio. So I'm going to see that on Tuesday, 6 p.m. when they submit their worksheet, to then see if they're able to go on to the next step, which is actually building their house. So those are the checkpoints and assessments which we do. We don't just leave them to it. When we set them the research and we say, now go off and do this, we give them certain points at which they have to check in. And then finally, the last step is that they submit or they present. So you can ask them to submit a picture or a poster or the measurements with their workings out to make sure that they've done it correctly. Or they can present it via Zoom. You can have a Zoom session and every student can have a chance to show their house to the rest of the class. Again, either a poster or an actual model. You can add to this and you can make it multidisciplinary. So you can say you also have to write a creative writing piece to, I don't know, show how the spider came to have his house. Or you can add design and art elements to it. What materials should we use, durability of materials, and so on. It's also nice when you present it, we have options, given that's via Zoom. You can do things, you have a lot of other options, but you can do things like invite grandparents to come and join too, and they can all see their grandchildren's work in maths, which is a lovely opportunity. Okay, I'm going to move on to another example. So the next example is completely different, and you'd better believe this, but this isn't actually COVID-19, and it wasn't actually created as a response to COVID-19. It's something I found online about the Black Death. So this time it's a key question. The last example was a project. This example is a key question. So the key question we're going to be asking is, can disease change the world? So I'm going to show you the website, a screenshot of the website. So to discuss a question like, can disease change the world, you can begin, as it says here, it says in the top right-hand corner, and this was just so perfect that I wanted to show it to you exactly as it is. But you can begin by discussing a recent outbreak of an infectious disease and how public officials responded, okay? And the questions that we're going to need to know or ask, the things we're going to need to understand are possibly, how did the Black Death start? How did it spread? What was the public response to it? What were the effects of the Black Death? Okay, how did it affect people? How did it affect businesses? How did it affect the economy? How did it affect governments? Okay, and so on. You provide resources and expectations, so those are going to be historical sources, obviously. And I want to show you what they've done is, again, for the checkpoints and assessment, they've actually split it into 3 smaller projects that the students can work through. So maybe this would be over 3 weeks, or maybe be over 2 weeks, 1.5 weeks for each. Okay, so they've broken it down to 3 parts where they discuss what was the Black Death, how did it spread so quickly, and how did it affect people. And for each one, they've given a small task. So write a description of the Black Death that includes its symptoms, construct a diagram illustrating how it spread, and create an illustration showing how it affected different groups of people in the 14th century. So all these things together are going to come together to help you understand how disease can change the world. And when the students are doing their research, they're going to be doing 3 mini research projects to help them come to the answer at the end of can disease change the world. Again, just to qualify what I said at the beginning, they haven't yet learned about the Black Death when you tell them we're going to be researching can disease change the world, which again is, I know I keep saying this, but I think it's so important. It's a whole different way of looking at things. It's not let's learn about the death, about the Black Death, let's learn about its effects, let's learn about its causes, and then let's debate whether disease can change the world. It's let's think about an issue, a real relevant and compelling issue, and learn some history in order to help us answer this issue. And then finally, they submit or present, right? So what they've done here is they've asked students to construct an argument and show on a poster or an essay. You can do this on a debate, on Zoom, okay, that discusses the impact of Black Death based on what you have understood. And there's another layer that they've added to this, which I think is fantastic, that you can do after that. It's just then to look for examples of how we can minimize the spread of disease based on what you have understood from your research about Black Death, and take public action. Okay, think of, sorry, I don't know what has just gone on here. Okay, here we go. Take action and create a public service announcement to advocate for improved methods of prevention and the control of the spread of diseases. Okay. So those are 2 main examples I wanted to share with you. So now to discuss, how do I start? How do I go about this? So if I want to create a project for my students through which they're going to be learning, where do I start? So the first thing that I do is I ask myself, what is my outcome for learning? This is something that I do whenever I begin teaching. What do I want the students to know, understand, be able to do by the end of it? Okay, so to use the water cycle example. So I want them to know how the water cycle works, I want them to understand how the water cycle works. I want them to know some key terms like precipitation and evaporation and their definitions, okay? I want them to be able to explain how the water cycle works, so that they should have such a good understanding that they could explain it to somebody else. So my next step, once I'm clear about my outcomes, is I'm going to ask a compelling question about the learning, okay? A big question. So my question I'm going to ask, and to go back to what I said earlier, to repeat what I said earlier, my question is going to be, where does rain come from? So I could say, my question could be, how does the water cycle work? But that's not relevant, holistic, or compelling. I mean, it's holistic, it does deal with the whole water cycle. But it's not compelling, it's not something the students necessarily are interested in. They're not necessarily curious to know how the water cycle works, right? But they probably are curious, if you ask them, because children are naturally curious, to know, where does rain come from? So I begin by asking my students, I ask myself, what are my outcomes for learning? And then I begin by asking my students, where does rain come from? And then step number 3 is, what can they do? What project can they do to help them achieve these outcomes? So if I want them to know and understand know the key terms, understand how it works, and be able to share it with somebody else, what can they do to help them achieve this? So maybe they can design a digital presentation such as a Prezi or a PowerPoint to demonstrate how it works. Maybe they can draw a poster. Maybe they can write, they can teach it to somebody else. So maybe we can teach it to the nursery school. So we can design a poster and then explain it to the nursery school via Zoom so that they understand how the water cycle works. Now I've put question number 2, the step number 2, the question, in gray, because you aren't necessarily always going to have a question. For example, to go back to the Native American Museum project, okay, I don't know if there's a good question that you could ask that fits in right. You might skip this step and you might say, what's my outcome for learning? How can I help them achieve this with a project? If you can ask a question, then do, because I think questions create relevance and they get us curious. They sort of create a vessel for which to hold information. Now, two tips are: number 1, simplicity is key. You're not there. So if the instructions are very complicated, or there are 6 levels of instructions, you're not so readily available to answer them. So you want it to be as easy as possible for students to answer on their own, okay, for them to understand on their own. And if the resources are super complicated, because there are 7 different types of resources, okay, that's also going to be that's going to be difficult for the students to work through without you. So I'm not saying dumb it down, okay, on the contrary, but the real learning, the real critical thinking happens not because of the complexity of the instructions or the complexity of the resources, but because of the design of the project. So if your question is a good one, like for example, you know, can there be another Great Depression? You're going to look at the sources and you're going to answer the question, and we're going to look at what the causes of the Great Depression were and what was put in place after to prevent another Great Depression and how things work nowadays. The design of the project isn't complicated, okay, but there's a lot of critical thinking potentially going on there. So keep it simple, keep it as simple as possible. That's tip number 1. Tip number 2 is, I would say, the longer assignments are better. So not too long that we lose momentum, but it does take time to prepare a project like this and put it together with resources and everything. And it doesn't necessarily take you that much longer to prepare a long project. And it's a more meaningful kind of get your teeth into project if it is longer. So I would recommend that you design projects that are supposed to stretch over, say, a week or so. And that's really, I would say that's an ideal length for project-based learning. So I've kind of made it easier, and I've given you, I've got my email address, by the way, on the last slide, and you can send me an email to ask me for a copy of the slides with pleasure. So I've given you 2 slides here with templates, not templates, but a list of suggestions. So what I find for myself that helps me a lot in my teaching is that if I have a list of activities, say list of starter activities suggestions, list of assessment activities, then when I'm planning a lesson, I just sort of go through the list and pick the one that is best suited for what I'm teaching on that day. And it's easier than kind of reinventing the wheel and thinking from scratch. So I've got 2 lists here. One is for project instructions and one is for presentation ideas. So what is my outcome? If I'm going to ask myself, what is my outcome for learning? And then what can the students do to help them achieve these outcomes? I can literally just pick, I have to choose my outcome for learning, something I have to figure out for myself based on what I'm teaching, what grade, what subject, and so on. But what can they do to help them achieve the outcomes? You've got a list here, 2 lists here, with ideas that you can just choose from. So for example, an instruction can be, you've got to clarify, and the way this is set up, just to clarify, is that there's words with dots in between and you fill them in, and the blue ones I filled in for you, okay? So for example, clarify fractions, verbs, metaphors, life cycles, anything for a younger grade. And this is a useful cop-out project. It's a great cheat. Whenever you're not sure of what project you can use to help the students learn something, teaching it to someone younger than you, clarifying it for someone else, is always a good way to learn, all right? We understand things best because we teach them to other people. So it's a great way to learn. So for example, how are you going to clarify fractions for a younger grade? So are we going to write a story that talks about somebody buying a pizza pie and dividing it up, okay? How can we teach life cycles to a younger grade, and so on? Compare something with something, simplify something for someone, okay, and so on. You can look through these yourselves. Change someone's mind about something, okay? So change a local business owner's mind about hiring convicted felons. debate the merit of something. So debate the merit of saving for a long-term goal compared to spending for a short-term goal. That's an economics or an English project. Okay, theorize what Florence Nightingale, who was the founder of modern nursing, would say about COVID-19. Think of an analogy for something, find another way to solve. Okay, so these are instructions that you can use as templates to create your own projects for your specific subject. And then in terms of presentation ideas, this is also a whole list of things that you can ask them to design a poster, to compare it to something similar, to create a words cloud. An interactive game is a really nice one to say, to go back to clarify fractions or verbs or so on for a younger game. A younger grade, can we create a game that's going to help teach about fractions or verbs and so on, okay? A really nice one to point out is, I like this a lot, I just sort of found the idea recently, is an alphabet book. So you know how you, there are these alphabet books, A is apple, B is ball, C is carrot, and so on. So create an alphabet book around a specific subject where you have to find something relevant to the subject for every single letter. Okay, so say a historical concept or something. And for each one, you have to write a sentence explaining it and explaining the relevance. Flowchart, diary entry to reflect on something, to reflect on one of the characters at the time, so on. So you start by thinking, what is my outcome? And is there a big question that I can ask about this? Not a question like, what were the causes and effects of the Great Depression? That screams boring. But a relevant question like, could there be another one? Or are we still affected by the Great Depression today, for example? Okay, are we still affected by the Second World War today? And so on. Okay, and then what can they do to help them achieve the outcomes? So I will choose something from this list if I find something, or I will choose something from this list if I find something. Now, I just want to end off with looking at lots of different examples of other projects. I find that for myself, I'm not a creative person, but I'm very good at taking other people's ideas and either using them or adapting them for my own subject. So I looked online, I found a lot of ideas and I adapted them, or I just used them, I copied and pasted them directly. So I think that the best way to really, I mean, for me, the best way to be able to think of ideas for myself and learn how to do something myself is by looking at other ideas and how it's done. So that's why I'm going to go through a whole bunch of examples, and hopefully that can help get us thinking and get our brains working. So example, what materials should we use to make a pot? So there are a whole load of things we have to think about here. What do we have to ask ourselves? How are we going to use a pot? Is it going to go in the oven? Is it going to go on a stove? Do we need to, if it goes in the oven, so we need to make sure there's nothing that could potentially melt. It needs to be able to get hot, but it shouldn't get too hot that we can't touch the handles. What about the lid? What about the screws that are used to bind the handle to the lid, okay, and so on. So this could be a lesson about conductors and insulators. It could be a lesson about durability of materials. They could look at unknown resources that discuss these things, and at the end they present by drawing. They're not going to make a pot, but they could draw a picture of the pot and annotate it with all the different materials and why they've chosen to use those different materials. Example number 2, create a guidebook for someone visiting a different country. So with, the language, some expressions in the language, history, key landmarks, and so on. Write a letter to someone 150 years ago explaining what they would expect what they should expect when they visit us today. So this could be an English project, it could be a history project, and so on. Create a poster, a drawing, a piece of jewelry, a collage, or anything from pictures that use, sorry, there's a typo there, different types of angles or triangles or shapes depending on the age. So this could be a project for younger kids where they have to use different shapes, specific shapes to design a drawing or piece of jewelry or so on. Or for older kids where they have to use different kinds of triangles or different angles. Document your family history is a very relevant and very, very valuable project in terms of having to think like a historian. So what kind of sources will we do we need to find? How are we going to find primary sources? How are we going to find secondary sources? How can we evaluate the reliability of sources? So if your great-grandfather who's 96 years old tells you something, can we evaluate the reliability? Can we corroborate it with something else, and so on? Interviewing skills, so teaching students how to interview, so how to, it's a massive skill, so how to ask questions, what kinds of questions to ask, how to respond, how to think on your feet, how to listen, and so on, and how to actually present this in the end in the most efficient way, how to present a family history document in the most efficient way. So they can learn personal history and historian skills and interview skills from a project like this. Some more examples. See the digestive system from the perspective of a cookie traveling through it, and compare that with the experience of an apple. So before we've learned about the digestive system, what would it be like to be a cookie going through the digestive system? So through this, we can learn all about it, and we can end up by writing a diary entry about the experiences of a cookie, okay? Debate is always a useful one. So debate who had the biggest impact on, fill in yourself, civil rights movement, world peace, science, etc. Rank inventions in terms of their impact. Physics project, why doesn't a microwave get hot? Okay, why is it that the food gets hot but the microwave isn't hot? So that's a big physics project, an advanced grade physics project. How do boats float? Also an advanced physics project, right? So you have to understand things like buoyancy, balance, density, waterproofing, and so on. Why do some things fall to the ground faster than others? So maybe we need to begin this by finding out what things fall to the ground faster than others. So direct the students to do some experiments at home and drop different things and see which things fall faster. And then we're going to reconvene to discuss the effect of mass and on velocity and so on. Did the attack on Pearl Harbor unify America? That's a big key question. Are there any ways, I've said this a few times, in which we're still affected by the Great Depression today? How does sugar feed slavery? Does social distancing help to contain a pandemic, which is an analysis of the 1918 Spanish flu, and so on. So whenever you can find a question, you can use it for the basis for a project, okay? And otherwise you can take, if you don't have a question, you can take anything from these two lists and use them to build your project around it. We have a minute, so I want to throw in here that there's massive opportunity for differentiation in teaching this way. In the classroom, when we're speaking, or over Zoom when we're speaking, we've only got one voice and we can only speak to one, we can only say one thing at a time, right? But if we're sending out packs of resources and questions, there is massive opportunity to differentiate with very, very little effort from us. So you have your standard question or questions and your standard resources, but then for the brighter students, you might add in some additional resources and an additional question, like an application question or an evaluation question, okay? And for the weaker students, you might take out a few of the sources and you might only ask them to answer 2 questions instead of 3 main questions at the end. And this isn't a huge amount of work for you, but it's a great way to differentiate. And there are, as I said, there are other ways to differentiate within this, because if there are asynchronous resources, then the weaker students can watch a video over and over and over again. There's also differentiation by output, because they're all going to submit a project that they themselves are capable of. Okay, so it's not that they have to answer specific questions on a worksheet, but they can do something to their ability, okay, and present to their ability. Okay, so to just end off by going back through the model, so we, again, to summarize, we start with our question, our instructions, we start with that, we don't end with that. We figure out what do we need to know to be able to do this. We give the resources and expectations for the final project. We give the project to the students to do the research, but we check in with them and assess as they go along. And then finally, they present or submit their work. So to just go back to our learning outcomes at the beginning, and you see I have my email address at the end. Our outcomes were to be able to design learning activities that rely less on the teacher and more on the students. So I'm hoping we've achieved that. And that require more critical thinking and active engagement from the students. So finally to conclude is that I would really say that we have to view this whole experience and opportunity that we have at the moment as a huge enrichment opportunity for our students and for ourselves as teachers, because we all know that we should be teaching in ways that rely less on us. We all know that we talk too much in the classroom. We all know we should be using more active learning. We all know there should be more critical thinking and active engagement in our classroom. But we don't always manage to put this into practice because, number one, preparation time is limited, and it's easier to just explain something to the class than to design a whole project that they're going to do on their own and figure out the learning on their own, okay? And also because we're worried about curriculum time, and it takes longer to teach this way, and if I can just tell them everything, then they'll know it, rather than for them to figure it out on their own is going to take so long. But at the moment, everything is different, right? So if you're teaching on Zoom for an hour and a half every day, versus preparing a project that might take you 2 hours at the beginning of the week, but then last the whole week. So it doesn't take longer to prepare in this way at the moment. And it doesn't, and the arguments about there not being enough curriculum time, well, at the moment, curriculum time the whole definition of curriculum time has changed anyways, because the pressures in terms of what we have to finish for a lot of us, the benchmark has moved because there is a global pandemic. So this is really an opportunity to develop skills like teaching with active learning and to improve our pedagogy and practice, so that when we return to the classroom, we'll find that this has become part of our repertoire and that we are better teachers from it. And although there are a lot of really, really nasty things happening with COVID-19, I think that education is shifting for the better. I think to a large extent, a lot of teachers are reevaluating what's my value add as a teacher. If I can send out a pre-recorded video and a worksheet that they submit afterwards, and it's no different to the way I teach in the classroom, and they're learning just as well, then what am I adding as a teacher in the classroom? Now, why don't we just have one 7th grade math teacher who creates videos for 7th grade students all over the world and sends out worksheets, and then they submit them to their local tutor for marking. So why, if this is the way I'm teaching now, and it's exactly the same as the way I teach in the classroom, and it's no different and it's working just as well, what is my value add as a teacher? So I think a lot of us are asking these big questions as to how am I engaging my students and how am I moving them forward with things like critical thinking. And please God, when classroom learning resumes, I think we are all going to be better teachers because of our experience at the moment. So good luck, everybody. And I'm going to now, you can unmute yourselves, and if anybody has any questions, please go ahead and ask.